Every organization we've covered in this series committed violence. That's the nature of the world we've been documenting. The underground economy runs on fear, and fear requires demonstration. But most of those organizations had limits, unspoken lines, things even the most ruthless operators understood you didn't cross, because crossing them brought heat nobody wanted, outrage nobody could manage, consequences that threatened the entire enterprise. The Philadelphia Black Mafia didn't recognize those lines. What this organization did during its peak years of operation wasn't just criminal violence in the service of profit. Some of it was so savage, so deliberately cruel, so willing to destroy innocent life, including the lives of children, that it forced an entire city to confront a question it didn't want to ask out loud. How did we let this happen here? Today we're going deep into the Black Mafia's most heinous acts, the ones that defined their legacy not just as a criminal organization, but as something darker. The murder of Major Coxon, the arson that burned families out of their homes, and the act that shocked the entire nation, the Hanafi Muslim massacre of 1973. 7 people murdered in a single house in Washington, D.C., 5 of them children, 1 of them 9 days old. This episode is not easy. It's not supposed to be. These were real people, real families, real losses that echoed for decades, but their stories deserve to be told, honestly, completely, without looking away. Before we get into the specific acts, it's worth establishing something clearly. The Black Mafia's violence was not reactive. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't the reluctant enforcement mechanism of an organization that preferred other methods. Violence was the Black Mafia's primary language. It was how they communicated authority, how they settled disputes, how they expanded territory, how they punished disloyalty, and, in some cases, how they expressed something that looked disturbingly like pleasure and domination. The organization had emerged from a specific Philadelphia moment, the intersection of Black nationalist politics, Nation of Islam infrastructure, and pure criminal opportunism in the late 1960s. It had the rhetoric of liberation, it had the organizational discipline of the Fruit of Islam, and it had an absolute willingness to visit catastrophic violence on anyone who stood in its way, including, with devastating regularity, the Black Philadelphia community it claimed to represent. By the early 1970s, the Black Mafia controlled significant portions of Philadelphia's numbers, racket, drug distribution, and extortion economy. That control was maintained through fear, and the events we're about to discuss are the moments when that fear was produced most dramatically and most monstrously. Major Benjamin Coxon was a man who understood Philadelphia's underworld intimately, and that understanding ultimately got him killed. Coxon was one of the most flamboyant and fascinating figures in the Philadelphia and South Jersey criminal and political landscape of the early 1970s. He was a hustler in the broadest sense, connected to drug money, to numbers operations, to legitimate business fronts, and remarkably to mainstream political figures who either didn't know or didn't care where his money came from. He had political relationships that gave him a veneer of respectability that most criminal operators could never have achieved. He was also connected to Muhammad Ali. The two men had a genuine friendship and business relationship that gave Coxon even more public visibility and social credibility. In the world Coxon moved through, those connections were currency. By 1973, Coxon had become entangled with the Black Mafia in ways that would prove fatal. The organization viewed him as someone who owed them money, tribute, respect, and who had not delivered sufficiently on any of those fronts. In the Black Mafia's accounting, that created a debt, and the Black Mafia collected its debts in blood when it chose to. On June 8, 1973, Black Mafia members went to Coxon's Cherry Hill, New Jersey home, a mansion that was itself a statement of how far this man had traveled from humble origins. What happened inside that house was brutally efficient and deliberately comprehensive. Coxon was murdered. 3 members of his family were also killed. His wife and others in the home were bound. It was a home invasion and murder designed to send a message that transcended the specific dispute with Coxon, a demonstration that the Black Mafia's reach extended beyond Philadelphia's city limits, that no address was safe enough, that wealth and political connections and friendship with Muhammad Ali meant absolutely nothing when the organization decided you were done. The murders sent shockwaves through Philadelphia and South Jersey's criminal and political world simultaneously. The message was received. You didn't need a translator. The Coxon murders represented the Black Mafia at its most coldly organizational, violence deployed with precision to solve a problem and simultaneously broadcast a message to everyone watching. There was nothing spontaneous about it, nothing emotional. It was business, which in some ways made it more disturbing than passion. If the Coxon murders demonstrated the Black Mafia's willingness to project violence outward against rivals and debtors, the arson attacks demonstrated something even more revealing about the organization's true relationship with its community. The Black Mafia engaged in a pattern of arson against Philadelphia businesses, most notably targeting stores and establishments whose owners had refused to pay protection or had otherwise fallen out of favor with the organization. One of the most significant of these involved a department store that served the North Philadelphia community. Let that land for a moment. A store serving the Black community that the Black Mafia claimed to represent and protect. Burn. The fire wasn't just property destruction. Buildings where people shopped, where community members worked, where some people lived above the storefronts, these were community infrastructure. Destroying them didn't hurt the white establishment or the oppressive system the Black Mafia's rhetoric was constantly railing against. It hurt Black Philadelphia, directly, materially, immediately. The arson attacks served multiple organizational purposes. They were enforcement, a demonstration to other business owners of what happened when you didn't pay. They were also intimidation in its most visceral form. Fire is primal. Fire is terrifying. Watching a building burn communicates something that even murder sometimes doesn't: a total willingness to destroy, to reduce things to ash, to leave nothing standing. But the community cost was real and lasting. Businesses destroyed meant jobs lost, goods unavailable, neighborhood commerce disrupted. The North Philadelphia neighborhoods where these fires occurred were already economically fragile. The Black Mafia's arson attacks made them more so, and then turned around and demanded tribute from whatever remained. It was predation wearing the costume of protection, and the community had no good options for how to respond. Now we come to the event that sits at the center of this documentary, the act that, more than any other single thing the Black Mafia did, revealed the absolute moral abyss at the heart of this organization. The Hanafi Muslim massacre of January 18, 1973, is one of the most horrific acts of mass murder in American urban history. It is not discussed as widely as it deserves to be, partly because its victims were Black, partly because the political and organizational context was complicated, and partly because America has a limited attention span for atrocities that don't fit clean narratives. But it deserves full attention, full weight, full reckoning. To understand it, you need to understand who the Hanafi Muslims were and why they had become a target. Hamas Abdul Khalis was a man with a complicated history inside Black American Islam. He had been a member of the Nation of Islam, had in fact been a national secretary of the organization, a trusted figure in Elijah Muhammad's inner circle. But by the late 1960s, Khalis had broken with the NOI publicly and dramatically. He rejected Elijah Muhammad's theology, specifically the NOI's racial cosmology, the doctrine of white devils and black gods that formed the core of the organization's theological framework. Khalis embraced Orthodox Sunni Islam, specifically the Hanafi school of Islamic jurisprudence, and became an outspoken critic of the NOI's departures from Orthodox Islamic teaching. He didn't just leave quietly. He wrote letters, detailed, theologically argued, openly contemptuous letters to NOI mosques around the country, challenging Elijah Muhammad's authority and doctrine directly. He called out what he saw as false teaching. He named names. He was not a man who did things halfway. In Washington, D.C., Khalis had built a genuine Hanafi Muslim community. He had a house, a substantial property in the 16th Street corridor of Northwest D.C. that served as both a family home and a community center for his followers. His community included his own family, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, people who had built their lives around his leadership and his faith. Among Khalis's most prominent supporters and friends was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then known as Lou Alcindor, already one of the most famous basketball players in the world. Abdul-Jabbar had converted to Hanafi Islam under Khalis's influence. That connection gave the Hanafi community a public profile and financial support that exceeded what its relatively small size would otherwise have commanded. The NOI leadership viewed Khalis as a dangerous critic. His letters were reaching mosque communities across the country. His theological challenges were substantive enough to require response, and his willingness to be publicly, aggressively confrontational represented a threat to the organization's authority that could not be left unanswered. The Black Mafia, with its deep NOI connections through Temple 12 in Philadelphia, became the instrument of that answer. January 18, 1973. On the morning of January 18, 1973, a group of Black Mafia members traveled from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. They went to the Hanafi Muslim house on 16th Street. They got inside. What followed was an act of violence so savage that the detectives and prosecutors who spent years on the case still struggled to find adequate language for it. 7 people were murdered inside that house. 5 of them were children. Khalis's son Dowd was drowned in a bathtub. Other family members were shot. And in the act that more than any other has defined this massacre in the historical memory of those who know about it, a 9-day-old infant, Khalis's granddaughter, was drowned. 9 days old. The baby had been alive for 9 days. The killers also shot and wounded several other people in the house, leaving them for dead. Hamas Abdul Khalis himself was not home when the attack occurred. He returned to find his family destroyed. The deliberateness of what was done to those children, the targeting of innocents, the murder of a 9-day-old baby, was not incidental to the attack. It was the point. The message being sent was not just to Khalis, it was to everyone who might consider challenging the NOI's authority or the Black Mafia's reach. It was a message written in the most extreme possible terms. There is no one we will not touch. There is no line we will not cross. Your children are not safe. Your newborns are not safe. That is not criminal violence in the service of profit. That is terrorism, pure and unambiguous. The investigation into the Hanafi massacre was complicated from the beginning by the organizational and political web surrounding it. Washington, D.C. law enforcement, working with federal investigators, built a case that connected the killers to the Philadelphia Black Mafia and ultimately to organizational direction connected to NOI circles. The trial that followed was one of the most significant prosecutions of Black organized crime in the early 1970s, predating by several years the broader RICO prosecutions that would eventually dismantle the Black Mafia's Philadelphia operation. Several men were convicted in connection with the murders and received substantial sentences. The prosecutions confirmed publicly what investigators had established, that this was not a spontaneous act of individual violence, but an organized, directed atrocity carried out by members of a criminal organization with religious and political connections. The NOI's leadership publicly denied any organizational direction of the attack. The question of exactly how high organizational knowledge and direction went has never been fully resolved to every investigator's satisfaction. What was established was that the men who carried out the murders were connected to the Philadelphia Black Mafia and to NOI adjacent networks. What the massacre did to Hamas Abdul Khalis is one of the most painful human threads running through this entire story. He lost his son, he lost grandchildren, he lost a 9-day-old granddaughter. He came home to a house full of the people he loved most destroyed, and he did not collapse quietly. In 1977, 4 years after the massacre, Collis led a dramatic takeover of 3 Washington, D.C. buildings, including the B'nai B'rith headquarters and the Islamic Center, taking over 100 hostages in a 2-day standoff that gripped the nation. His demands included the surrender of the convicted killers of his family and the withdrawal of the film Muhammad, Messenger of God, which he considered blasphemous. The standoff ended through negotiations involving ambassadors from several Muslim-majority countries. One person was killed during the takeover. Collis and his followers were convicted and sentenced to prison. It was the act of a man shattered beyond the capacity for measured response. A man who had watched the justice system move on the killers of his children and grandchildren and found that movement insufficient. A man whose grief had curdled into something that put innocent people in danger. It does not excuse the hostage taking, but it contextualizes it in a way that simple condemnation cannot capture. What was done to Hamas Abdul Khalis and his family on January 18, 1973, broke something in him that never healed. The Black Mafia did that to a man of genuine faith, to children who had done nothing, to a 9-day-old baby girl who had been alive for less than 2 weeks. Taken together, the Coxon murders, the arson attacks, the Hanafi massacre, these acts paint a portrait of an organization that had moved entirely beyond any limiting principle. The rhetoric of Black liberation that gave the Black Mafia its political cover and community credibility was exposed by these acts as precisely what it was: cover, rhetoric. A costume worn over something that had nothing to do with liberation and everything to do with power, money, and a capacity for cruelty that served neither. An organization genuinely committed to Black liberation does not burn down stores in Black neighborhoods, does not murder Black families in their homes, does not drown Black children in bathtubs, does not kill a 9-day-old Black baby girl. Those acts are the receipts. The documentation of what the Black Mafia actually was underneath the language it dressed itself in. Philadelphia's Black community, already living under economic disinvestment, police brutality, and institutional abandonment, deserved none of what was done to it in the name of organizations claiming to be its champions. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality of the Black Mafia is most visible, most damning, most undeniable in these specific acts. History has a tendency to remember the perpetrators of acts like these. Their names get attached to documentaries, true crime series, cultural mythology. The organizations they built become subjects of academic study and street legend simultaneously. The victims deserve better than that imbalance. Major Coxon's family. The people burned out of their homes and livelihoods by Black Mafia arson. And the Hanafi victims, Dawood Khalis, his siblings, his niece, a 9-day-old child whose name most people reading about this era have never learned. They were real people, with families who grieved them, with futures that were stolen, with stories that ended because an organization built on the language of Black dignity decided that no life was too innocent to sacrifice for its purposes. That is the Black Mafia's truest legacy. Not the power, not the mythology, not the organizational sophistication that law professors use as case studies. The children in that house on 16th Street in Washington, D.C. on January 18, 1973. Remember them, hit like and subscribe, and drop in the comments. Which story in this series has affected you the most? Who do you want us to cover next?